What would you do? If in the dead of night your 5-year-old child suddenly sat up in bed drenched in sweat, eyes blank and screamed, "It can't breathe." And when you rush to him, heart pounding, caught between fear and disbelief, he points directly to the 4th step on the staircase. It's in there. You pull away the wood, a nailed wooden box. And inside, something still alive, gasping for breath, with eyes that have witnessed unspeakable horrors. This isn't a horror film. It's a true story. And what happens next will chill you even deeper. Make sure to subscribe now to follow more spine-tingling, heartwarming, and mysterious stories like this, where every tale is a whisper from the soul, just waiting for you to listen. Under a pale gray sky and the lazy drift of the first winter snow, the moving truck groaned to a stop in front of the house on Caraway Lane. Sarah McNeil stepped out first, pulling her wool coat tighter around her frame, her breath fogging in the frigid Toronto air. Behind her, Daniel hopped down, stretching his back, then circled around to open the rear of the truck. Well, he muttered with half-hearted optimism, it's not haunted. That's a start. From the back seat of the SUV, a small face pressed up against the window. Eyes wide and unblinking, Liam, 5 years old, stared at the house like it might blink back. The house was old, undeniably so, colonial bones, weathered by decades of storms and silence. Its clapboard siding was chipped, the paint the color of forgotten things, and the black shutters on the windows clung on as if by will. Most prominent was the wraparound porch, and just inside the door, a grand staircase coiled upward, spine-like. Every step creaked in the wind even now, though no one had touched them. The boy remained in the car, unmoving. Sarah walked around, opened the door. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's go see your new room." Liam didn't move. "Mom," he whispered, "is there a dog?" "No, baby, not yet. Maybe after we settle in." He turned his head slowly, like something in the house had caught his ear. "I think there is," he said. Daniel appeared beside them, brushing snow from his shoulders. "What's that, champ?" Liam blinked. "I think there's a dog inside. It knows my name." Sarah and Daniel exchanged a glance. It was one of those things children said, strange, dreamy, maybe even poetic, but likely born from a cartoon or a book they couldn't remember reading him. Still, something about the precision in Liam's voice, a mix of certainty and soft dread, caused Sarah's breath to hitch just slightly. The first night in a new house always feels unfamiliar. Shadows that once belonged to strangers seem to linger in corners. The wind knocks in rhythms you haven't learned yet. But for Liam, the house didn't feel unfamiliar. It felt aware. His room was at the top of the stairs, painted in calming shades of blue and gray. Sarah had arranged his toys, set his dinosaur nightlight near the bed, and tucked his favorite storybook under the pillow. The walls were bare, save for a single-frame drawing he had made weeks ago, a smiling sun and a crooked house beneath it, with a stick figure and a small blob-like dog standing in front. But by bedtime, Liam didn't want to stay in the room. "I can hear it breathing," he said. Sarah smoothed his hair. "That's just the heater kicking in, honey." He shook his head. "No, it's under the stairs." At midnight, Sarah woke to soft thuds echoing through the floorboards. Not loud, just subtle, dull knocks, as if someone were tapping from within the walls. She got up, padded down the hallway, checked Liam's room. He was asleep, curled in a tight ball, his little fists clenched around his blanket. She stepped down the stairs, barefoot and silent. The old steps creaked in protest. At the 4th stair, she paused. The wood beneath her feet felt wrong, slightly hollow. She crouched, knocking her knuckles against it. A low, dull echo answered. Behind her, Daniel's voice made her jump. "You're going to scare yourself more than him." She sighed, laughing it off. "He said he hears breathing." "He's 5. He also said his potato chips were talking to him last week." But later that night, as she lay back in bed, Sarah stared at the ceiling and felt something gnawing, not fear exactly, but unease. There had been something behind that stare, or under it. The next morning, Liam was up early. Too early. He sat on the floor in the hallway outside his room sketchbook, in lap crayon clenched in his small hand. The drawing was messy but specific, a wooden box, lines heavy and jagged, a pair of circles that resembled eyes peering out from behind vertical slats. No dog, no person, just the box under what looked unmistakably like stairs. Sarah crouched beside him. "What's that, baby?" "It's where it's hiding," Liam said plainly. Daniel passed by with coffee double-take, glancing at the drawing. "Okay, that's something." "Sweetheart," Sarah began, carefully. "Did you dream this?" Liam looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "No, it told me." Silence settled in like a cold draft. Sarah forced a smile. "Told you what?" Liam turned his face back to the page. "That it can't breathe." That evening, While unpacking boxes in the living room, Sarah found an old photo buried beneath a stack of faded books. It was likely left behind by the previous owner. The photo was black and white, an elderly man sitting on the porch of the house, a medium-sized dog resting at his feet. The man's face was stern, unwelcoming. But the dog's eyes. She was still staring when Liam walked in, saw the photo, and froze. "That's him," he said. Sarah's heart skipped. "Who?" He pointed not at the man, at the dog. "That's the one that knows me." Later that night, the snow came harder. Wind howled through the chimney like a ghost in mourning. The power flickered once, then held. Liam refused to sleep in his bed. He sat at the top of the stairs, knees pulled to his chest, whispering into the dark. Sarah didn't interrupt at first. But as the minutes ticked past, unease turned to dread. She stepped quietly into the hall, listening. "It's okay," Liam whispered. I know it hurts." "Liam," she called softly. He didn't answer. When she reached him, he was staring down at the stairs, unblinking. His breath fogged the air. The heat in the house had dipped inexplicably. Sarah crouched beside him, tried to pull him up, but he resisted. "If I leave, it'll think I don't care," he said. Sarah held him close, carrying him back to bed. His small hands were like ice. That night he dreamt of boxes and breathless silence. By the third day, Sarah and Daniel were arguing. "He's inventing it because he's overwhelmed," Daniel insisted. Sarah shook her head. "No, this is different. You don't see how he watches the staircase? Like he's waiting for something to come out of it. He's 5. 5-year-olds believe in monsters. That's what they do. But this isn't monsters. It's specific. That box he drew, the eyes, the breathing." Daniel drained his coffee, sighed. "You want me to tear up the damn staircase to prove there's nothing there?" Sarah stared into her cup. "No," she whispered. "I want you to listen to our son." That evening, Liam stood silently in front of the staircase for nearly 10 minutes. Then, as if remembering something he had forgotten, he turned to Sarah and said, "His name was Echo. But that's not what he was called before. He told me Echo's just what's left." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "He said the rest of him got left in the box. But the Echo got out." Sarah knelt to meet his eyes. "Who told you that?" Liam didn't blink. "He did. The man. In my room last night." Sarah's stomach dropped. Daniel, overhearing, came over quickly. "What man, Liam? That's not funny." "I wasn't joking," the boy said. "He had the same eyes as the dog, only sadder." Bah. That night, Sarah found Liam standing in the kitchen, in the dark, barefoot and wide-eyed. "Mommy," he whispered. "Can we let it out now?" Sarah pulled him into her arms. "What do you mean?" "It's starting to forget how to breathe." Sarah carried him to the couch, cradled him until his eyes closed. But her own stayed wide open, staring at the stairs. The fourth step groaned once, under no weight at all. And in that moment, Sarah McNeil's scientific rational grounded finally wondered if, maybe just maybe, their new house was trying to say something. Or someone was. Because ever since they arrived, Liam hadn't stopped listening, and now so had she. It started just after midnight. Sarah had been lying in bed, her eyes shut, body willing sleep to come when she heard it so soft she thought it might have been the house settling. A faint, almost apologetic scratching sound. Not rhythmic, not persistent. Just there. Faintly clawing at the edges of silence. She opened her eyes. Daniel was already asleep beside her chest, rising and falling in the slow, even rhythm of someone long gone into dreams. She waited unsure, holding her breath against the hush of the room. Then again, scratch. Pause. Scratch. Faint and uncertain. She sat up slowly, listening, frowning. Their new home had creaky walls and noisy pipes, sure, but this didn't sound like plumbing or wind. It was alive. It had hesitation, intention. A sound made by something waiting for someone to notice. The stairs. She got out of bed, pulling her sweater on over her nightshirt, and crept out into the hallway. The air was cooler than expected, biting slightly against her bare legs. The staircase loomed ahead, curling downward into the unlit first floor. A stretch of moonlight spilled in from the landing window, making the hallway seem longer, thinner, like it had warped in the night. As she descended each step, they moaned beneath her feet. Not dramatically, just subtle whimpers of old wood disturbed. She stopped at the fourth stair. The same one. There was no sound now. Just stillness. She stood there a moment longer, squinting into the shadows that gathered beneath the railing, and slowly lowered herself onto the step. It groaned beneath her like an exhale. She knocked lightly on the riser with her knuckles. Hollow. Not just empty, but hollow in a way that felt unnatural. Too perfect, but nothing happened. No sound came back. No scratching. No breathing. No whispering whimpers. The house fell still again, as if it had been holding its breath, and she had just interrupted a secret. Sarah exhaled and shook her head at herself. Just nerves. Just a new house. Just an overactive mind tangled in her son's growing unease. She padded back to bed and slid in quietly, pulling the covers up, willing the night to pass. Down the hall in the dark, a child's eyes blinked open. By morning, Liam was already awake, dressed in the same pajamas he'd worn the night before, sitting cross-legged in the corner of the living room. The sketchpad Daniel's sister had given him lay across his lap. Crayons, black-brown, a dull gray, were scattered like tiny weapons around him. He was drawing again. Sarah, now familiar with his new obsession, approached gently and knelt beside him. "What are you working on, honey?" Liam didn't answer at first. His little hand kept moving in slow, deliberate strokes, his tongue sticking slightly out of the corner of his mouth. His brow was furrowed, not in frustration, but something heavier, like he was remembering something difficult, something not entirely his. Then he turned the page toward her. The drawing was crude, childlike in proportion, but unmistakably powerful in imagery. A large wooden box, outlined in heavy black strokes, stood alone in a narrow space. A series of thick, dark lines sealed its edges, drawn over and over in repetition. But it was the eyes that made her breath catch. Two circles, uneven but hauntingly expressive, stared out from inside the box. Not cartoonish, not cute. Frightened, resigned, and watching. "What is this?" she asked softly, throat dry. Liam shrugged, not looking up. "It's where he's stuck." "Who's stuck, baby?" "The dog." She blinked. "You mean Echo?" He shook his head. "No. I don't know his name yet. But he's been there a long time." Sarah swallowed, unsure how to proceed. "Where is this?" Liam pointed behind him, at the stairs. Daniel later was not amused. "I'm calling a child therapist," he muttered, pacing the kitchen. "This is getting out of hand." Sarah folded her arms. "He's not hurting anyone, Dan. He's just processing. He's drawing animals trapped in boxes, saying they know his name, whispering in corners. That's not processing, that's disturbing. He's not whispering to himself." Daniel paused. "What's that supposed to mean?" "He talks to someone," she said quietly, like someone's answering back. Daniel looked at her like she'd just admitted to hearing voices herself. "You're starting to sound like him." Sarah didn't flinch. "He's 5. You think he can come up with that kind of imagery on his own?" "He's imaginative. He's scared." They stood in silence, the air thick with concern and quiet accusation. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Look, I just think we should get ahead of this, before it turns into something more serious." Sarah looked past him through the kitchen doorway to where Liam now sat curled on the couch blanket around his shoulders, staring blankly at the staircase. She didn't say it out loud, but she didn't think this was something anyone could get ahead of. That night, she found him again in the living room. The house had gone quiet. But Liam was wide awake, seated on the floor near the base of the staircase, knees drawn to his chest facing the wall. He was whispering, low and steady. Sarah approached slowly. "Liam." He didn't look back, didn't flinch. Just kept talking in that gentle, coaxing tone you'd use with a frightened animal. She kneeled beside him. "Sweetheart." "He's not mad," Liam said. Sarah blinked. "Who's not mad?" "The one in the box." Sarah's pulse thudded in her ears. "Liam, honey, there's no one in a box." "Yes, there is." "Where?" He pointed at the 4th stair without hesitation. Sarah followed his gaze, her mouth dry. "I can't hear him all the time," Liam continued. "But when I sit real still, and I wait long enough, I can feel him thinking." Sarah pulled him gently into her arms. "You've had a lot of change lately. A big move, new school, new home. It's normal to feel strange." "I don't feel strange," he said. "What do you feel?" Liam looked at her then. Really looked. "I feel like I was supposed to come here." She felt a chill go down her spine. The next day, Daniel came home with a parenting book and a list of child therapists in the area. "This isn't about ghosts," he said firmly. "It's about stress, anxiety, maybe delayed processing. Kids Liam's age don't always have the words for what they feel, so they create stories. That's what this is." Sarah didn't answer. She was staring at a new drawing Liam had taped to the wall. It was different from the others. In this one, the box was deeper, more shadowed. But the eyes were now joined by faint streaks coming from the corners, tears, maybe. Above the box, Liam had drawn a speech bubble. Inside it, written in block letters, was a question. "Can anyone hear me?" Later, as she was tucking him into bed, Liam turned to her eyes, wet in the dim light. "Mom." "Yes, baby." "If someone got locked up and nobody found them for a really long time, would they stop trying to get out?" Sarah hesitated. "Why do you ask that?" "Because," he whispered, "I think he's starting to forget how." He rolled over, face pressed into the pillow. Sarah stood there a long moment, unable to move. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned off the nightlight. She didn't sleep that night. Just before dawn, Sarah stood at the base of the stairs again, alone. The fourth step loomed silent and ordinary. She crouched and knocked again, 2 soft taps. Nothing answered. No sound. No whisper. But her hand tingled afterward, a numb, echoing pressure that ran up her fingers and into her palm, as if something beneath the wood had leaned into her touch. She backed away slowly, the hair on her arms rising. Behind her, a soft voice carried through the early gray light. "Mom!" Liam stood at the top of the stairs, eyes wide, face pale. "Did you hear him too?" The night was brittle with cold, the kind that gnawed at window panes and crept under doors, despite the furnace humming at full strength. Outside, the snow had thickened into a silent white sheet, masking the world in hush. But inside the house on Caraway Lane, a storm of a different kind was stirring. It began with the sound of breath. Not Sarah's, not Daniel's. Liam's, short, ragged, urgent. Sarah shot up in bed before she knew why. Something instinctual, older than logic, had yanked her awake. Beside her, Daniel stirred but didn't wake. The alarm clock read 2:16 a.m. Then came the whisper. A thin, reedy voice from down the hall. "Mommy." She flung the blankets aside and ran barefoot across the hardwood floor. The hallway stretched like a tunnel. Liam's door was ajar, light from his dinosaur nightlight spilling across the carpet like a pool of green fog. He was sitting up in bed, knees hugged to his chest, trembling. Sarah rushed to his side, hands instantly on his cheeks, his arms, his forehead. His skin was clammy, his face pale and damp with sweat. His lips were dry, his breath quick and shallow. "Liam, baby, what's wrong?" He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, wide, unblinking, full of something ancient and urgent. "He's not breathing," he said. "What, who's not breathing?" "The dog. He's running out." Sarah's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Liam's hand moved slowly, but decisively, lifting his trembling arm to point past her, past his door down the hallway. "The fourth step," he whispered. "He's under the wood. He's going to die." Sarah stared at him, stunned. Something in his tone, it wasn't pleading. It wasn't frightened. It was factual. Raw. Certain. "Okay," she whispered, brushing damp curls from his forehead. "Okay. We'll check, sweetheart. Just lie back, all right?" But he didn't move. Daniel appeared a moment later, bleary-eyed and groggy. "What's going on?" "He's burning up," Sarah said, panic rising in her voice. "And he says the dog under the stair can't breathe." Daniel sighed heavily, rubbing at his temples. "Jesus Christ, not this again. Dan, this has to stop." He snapped, voice low and tense. "He's sleep-talking, hallucinating maybe. I told you this place is getting to him." "He's sick," Sarah shot back. "And he's trying to tell us something." Daniel turned, eyes bloodshot, exhausted and raw. "So what, Sarah? You want me to tear up the whole goddamn staircase because our 5-year-old says an imaginary dog is suffocating under it?" Liam flinched at the volume. Sarah rounded on Daniel like a mother wolf. "Then prove him wrong." A beat passed. Daniel looked between her and the boy, sweating, shaking lips, muttering something too soft to hear. Daniel threw his hands in the air. "Fine." Downstairs, the house seemed to hold its breath. Daniel fetched a flashlight and a crowbar from the garage. Sarah carried Liam wrapped in a thick blanket, his skin hot against her chest. His eyes fluttered open, only to close again. Fever dreams spilled from his lips in a stream of fractured whispers. "Don't leave him. It's dark. It's so dark." Daniel knelt before the stairs, laid the flashlight on the floor, and pressed a palm to the fourth step. It felt solid, but then again it always had. He gave it a few experimental taps. Hollow. With a grunt, he wedged the tip of the crowbar between the riser and the stair tread, and pried. The old wood resisted, then groaned as nails gave way with reluctant pops. Sarah stood behind him, rocking Liam gently, whispering in his ear. "It's okay, baby. Daddy's checking." When the board finally came loose, Daniel lifted it and peered into the dark cavity below. Nothing. Just old dust cobwebs and cold air. He exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow, then turned. "There's nothing there." Liam's eyes snapped open. He stared at the opening, no into it, his lips trembling. "He's deeper in," Liam said. Daniel turned back, flashing the beam farther into the cavity. The space under the staircase stretched beyond sight, sloping into shadow. But there was nothing he could see. Just wood and void. "No dog," he muttered. But Sarah wasn't looking at Daniel anymore. She was staring at Liam, because his breathing had changed. It had gone shallow, slower. She lowered him to the couch, pressing the back of her hand to his neck. "He's burning up. We need to bring him in. Now." Daniel's face twisted in frustration. "Sarah, He's sick, Daniel," she snapped. "Argue with me later." At the hospital, the waiting room was lit with flickering fluorescent light and filled with the low murmurs of other families cradling their emergencies. A nurse took Liam in quickly, his temperature climbing past 102. Sarah sat with her hands clenched tight in her lap, her mind reeling. Daniel stood nearby, arms crossed, jaw tight. Do you still think this is nothing? She asked, not even looking at him. He didn't answer. The doctor came out 20 minutes later, smiling gently. Viral fever? Common for kids his age. We've started him on fluids and meds. He should be fine in a day or two. Sarah thanked him, relief washing through her like a wave of guilt. But that relief soured when she stepped into the hospital room and saw Liam sitting up, eyes wide open, still pale but no longer shaking. He turned toward her the moment she entered. You didn't go deep enough, he said. Sarah knelt beside his bed. What, sweetheart? There's more behind the wall, he whispered. He's still there. Daniel stood in the doorway, arms limp at his sides. Sarah's hand shook as she reached out to brush hair from Liam's brow. I have to go back, the boy murmured. His eyes were closing again, but his lips still moved. Please, Mommy. He's trying not to die. They returned home just before sunrise. The house greeted them with silence. No scratches, no whispers. But the fourth step now seemed to throb with meaning. Sarah didn't sleep. Daniel tried tossing in and out of shallow naps, muttering to himself. She spent the day watching Liam breathe. That night, Liam's fever broke, but he didn't wake. He lay still in bed, cheeks flushed, lips cracked. And then just after 2:00 a.m., he shot upright, like a puppet on strings. His eyes didn't register the room. His mouth opened. Mommy, he screamed. He's not breathing. Sarah burst into the room, nearly slipping on the hardwood. Liam was standing on his bed now, pointing toward the hallway with trembling hands. They left him, they closed it, and left him. Daniel stumbled in behind her, breathless. What's happening? Liam turned to them, his face a mask of desperation. You have to go back. If you don't go now, he won't make it. Sarah knelt in front of him, clutching his shoulders. Sweetheart, listen to me. Who won't make it? His lip quivered. He's all alone. It's cold. He forgot what air tastes like. Daniel looked at the hallway, then at the crowbar, lying by the wall, still dusted in sawdust from the night before. And something in him, maybe disbelief, maybe anger, maybe the tiniest seed of guilt, snapped. I'll dig the whole goddamn thing out if it shuts him up. He marched past them, grabbed the crowbar, and returned to the stairs. This time he pried out 2 more steps. The hole yawned open wider, and that's when he saw it. In the deepest pocket of the crawl space, nearly hidden behind stacked beams and a slanting beam of darkness, was the corner of a wooden box. His breath caught. He reached out, pushing past spiderwebs and insulation. His hand struck something solid. Wood, old, splintered, and warm. Sarah, he whispered. She stepped forward. Get Liam out of the room. Daniel's face had gone pale. It's real. The storm outside had broken into a whisper of sleet tapping against the windows, as if the sky itself didn't want to wake the house. But inside, the scream tore through every room. He can't breathe. Mommy, run. He's dying. Sarah jolted upright before the final word left Liam's throat. Daniel scrambled after her, both of them crashing out of bed as if yanked from sleep by a hand. The sound of Liam's voice wasn't just fear, it was agony. It was desperate. It wasn't a nightmare's scream. It was a call to action. They sprinted down the hallway, not bothering with slippers, not bothering with light. The dim orange glow of a street lamp outside was the only thing guiding their frantic steps. Liam, Sarah cried out, but she didn't have to ask where he was. He was already downstairs. They found him at the foot of the staircase, standing barefoot in nothing but thin pajamas. His body trembled violently, whether from fever or something deeper Sarah couldn't tell. His face was pale as milk, his skin glistening with cold sweat. But his eyes were wide-focused and filled with a clarity that chilled her more than any winter wind. He pointed at the 4th step. There, he said hoarsely. He's still in there. Please, open it all the way. Please. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't hesitate. He threw himself down the remaining steps, snatched the crowbar that had been left by the wall, and dropped to his knees in front of the stair. Every motion was violent, decisive, like a man digging through the earth to get to something lost inside himself. The crowbar shrieked as it bit into the wood. Nails screamed as they ripped free. Dust exploded in bursts as the old stair fractured layer by layer, like the ribs of something ancient finally giving way. Sarah pulled Liam into her arms. His skin was boiling. She could feel the heat seeping through her nightshirt, but he pushed away from her just enough to keep staring at the spot Daniel was breaking open. Faster, he murmured. We're almost too late. Daniel heaved the final board free with a growl. The cavity yawned wide darkness inside, like a pocket of ancient air, untouched for years. He aimed the flashlight and stopped breathing. Daniel, Sarah whispered. But he didn't answer. She moved forward slowly, her arms wrapped around Liam like a shield, and peered over her husband's shoulder. At first, it looked like nothing but an old wooden crate tucked beneath the skeletal curve of the stairs. But then, the beam of light shifted, caught on something that shouldn't have reflected. Eyes, dry, glassy, half-lidded. Set into a sunken face, framed by matted fur, trembling so slightly, she almost missed it. Oh my God, Sarah breathed. The crate was barely large enough to hold the form crumpled inside. A dog? No collar? No tags? Fur matted with filth and sawdust lay curled in a limp heap. The sides of the box were reinforced with what looked like makeshift nails. A few slats of wood were cracked, others had tiny scratches along the inside claw marks. Desperate ones. One paw was stretched forward, pressed against the wood, like it had been trying to remember what air felt like. It blinked once, then its chest moved barely. A gasp, a rasp, a wheeze so shallow it sounded like the last bit of breath before silence. Daniel dropped the crowbar and scrambled forward. "We need to get it out. Now!" "Is it Daniel? Is it alive?" "I don't know. I think..." Yes. Yes, it's breathing. Barely." "Don't move it too fast," Sarah warned, kneeling beside him, her voice breaking. Daniel carefully wedged his fingers under the lid of the crate. "These nails are rusted shut. God, whoever did this didn't want it found." "Just open it," Liam screamed. Daniel's knuckles went white as he pulled. The nails groaned. Wood cracked. Then with a shuddering pop, the top broke free. The smell hit them first. Stale rot-soaked fur, old panic. But under it all, there was something worse, the smell of resignation. Of life being extinguished slowly, over days, maybe weeks. The dog didn't flinch as light flooded its box. It didn't growl, didn't bark. It simply lifted its head by a fraction of an inch, enough to let its eyes fall on Liam. The boy stepped forward out of Sarah's arms, shaking violently. "Liam," she whispered. But he was already moving one foot in front of the other, walking with a purpose that no fever could cloud. He dropped to his knees in front of the open crate. The dog's gaze followed him, slow, deliberate, almost reverent. Then its eyes closed. "No, no, no, no," Liam cried. "Stay, I'm here, I came." He reached forward, tiny hands brushing the edge of the crate. Then slowly, he reached in past the filth, past the splinters, and laid his palm against the dog's sunken ribcage. "I'm here now," he whispered. "I found you. I found you." And the dog somehow impossibly let out a sound, a whimper, the faintest broken echo of a bark. Then inch by inch it moved. Its head tilted, its nose pressed into Liam's hand, and it stayed there, unmoving. As if for the first time, in a very long time, it was home. "Bye," Sarah was crying before she knew it. Daniel had collapsed backward onto the floor, one hand over his mouth, the other pressed to his chest, like he couldn't believe what he'd just unearthed. Liam sat silently, one hand still resting on the dog's ribs, the other stroking its ear with a tenderness no 5-year-old should have had to learn. "You're safe now," he whispered. "You don't have to be scared anymore." Sarah moved beside him, laying a hand on his back. "We need to take him to the vet," she said softly. Liam nodded. "Can he come with us?" he asked. Sarah's throat tightened. "Of course." Liam stood, carefully, slowly, and the dog, exhausted, emaciated, lifted its head just enough to follow him with its eyes. Daniel brought a blanket. Sarah found an old milk crate from the garage to use as a makeshift carrier. The dog didn't resist. It simply allowed itself to be lifted, eyes never leaving Liam. As they drove through the empty, snow-dusted streets toward the emergency animal clinic, Sarah glanced into the back seat. Liam sat beside the crate, his fingers poking through the plastic slats, resting gently on the dog's matted fur. "I told him I'd come," Liam murmured. Sarah blinked back tears. Daniel said nothing, but for the first time since they'd moved in, silence didn't feel hostile. It felt holy. But at the clinic, the vet tech took one look at the dog and didn't ask any questions. She rushed it to the back, barking orders like gunfire. Sarah stood at the counter, her hands shaking as she signed forms. Daniel rubbed his forehead, pacing. Liam sat alone on a vinyl bench, staring at the swinging door where the dog had disappeared. An hour later, the vet emerged. She looked tired, but she was smiling. Malnourished? Dehydrated? Severe neglect? But she paused, smiled again. "He's a fighter. Whoever found him saved his life by minutes, maybe seconds." Sarah's knees nearly gave. Daniel caught her. Liam didn't move. "Can I see him?" he asked. The vet nodded. "Of course. He's weak, but he's stable." Liam slid off the bench, walked into the back with the vet. Daniel and Sarah followed a step behind. They entered a quiet room where the dog-cleaned bandaged IV line in place lay on a soft blanket. Its eyes opened and found Liam again. This time it wagged its tail. Only once, but it wagged. Liam knelt, brushing his hand over the dog's nose. "I told you I'd come," he whispered. The dog let out a breath that sounded like peace. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, the house back on Caraway Lane began to exhale too. The waiting room at the emergency veterinary clinic was still and cold, washed in sterile white light and the faint hum of fluorescent tubes. The place smelled faintly of antiseptic bleach and something else, more primal animal fear, the kind that clung to the walls in the quiet moments between emergencies. Sarah sat with her arms wrapped around Liam, both of them still in the clothes they'd been wearing when they tore out of the house. Her coat was draped around her son's small shoulders like armor. He hadn't spoken since they left the house, but his eyes never moved from the door through which the dog had disappeared. Daniel sat opposite them, elbows on knees, hands clenched, staring at the floor like he could force it to give him answers. Inside the back room, a team of vet techs moved around the battered body of the dog that had been locked in darkness. The crate was gone, the nails discarded, the box broken. But the damage, physical and otherwise, had sunk into the animal's bones. The veterinarian, Dr. Keller, moved swiftly but gently. Her fingers trained by years of practice, her eyes focused but soft. She whispered instructions to her team fluids. IV now, full panel. Chest sounds shallow, check lungs. Temps low, he's dehydrated beyond threshold. They worked in silence, the urgency crackling through the room like static electricity. Then she saw something that stopped her mid-sentence. The heart monitor, still pulsing, faintly, struggling, but there. Dr. Keller leaned closer, stethoscope pressed to the ribcage. My God, she breathed. This dog shouldn't be alive. She looked over to the assistant beside her, who was pale and wide-eyed. No food, no water. At least 6, maybe 7 days. Locked in a box. She shook her head slowly. And the heart's still fighting. Back in the waiting room, the door opened with a soft creak. Dr. Keller stepped out. Sarah stood immediately, one arm protectively over Liam. Daniel rose more slowly, cautiously, like preparing for a blow. Dr. Keller gave them a small, stunned smile. He's alive, she said. 3 words, that was all. But the weight of them knocked the air from Sarah's lungs. Daniel took a half step forward. Is he okay? The vet nodded slowly. He's severely malnourished, critically dehydrated. But his vitals are holding. No internal bleeding, nothing broken, which is a miracle considering the conditions. She looked down at Liam, then back at them both. You said you found him. In a box, Daniel murmured, dazed, under our stairs. The vet raised an eyebrow, but didn't ask for more. She'd seen stranger things in her career. Not many, but enough. Would you like to see him? She asked. Liam didn't wait for permission. He was already walking toward the open door, his small feet padding quietly over the tile. Sarah followed him, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure it echoed down the hallway. They turned into a recovery room. Soft lighting blankets stacked neatly in the corners, the faint beeping of a heart monitor. The dog lay on a fleece-lined pad, hooked up to IVs, a warming blanket over its back. Its fur had been lightly trimmed and cleaned around the worst of the matting. The ribs were stark. The eyes were sunken. But the moment Liam stepped inside, the dog's head lifted. It was barely a twitch at first, like the memory of a motion long forgotten. Then came the sound, a low, fragile whine. A plea, a greeting, recognition wrapped in pain. Liam moved forward slowly. The dog's eyes followed him, locked onto him with something beyond sight. Not just recognition, but relief. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Daniel leaned into the doorframe, frozen. Liam knelt beside the blanket, reached out a hand. The dog moved again, inch by inch, dragging its frail body forward just enough to press its nose into the boy's palm. It was the smallest gesture, and the loudest moment in the room. Liam let out a breath like he'd been holding it since the moment they left the house. Then he smiled. A real one. The first in days. He says he's okay now, Liam whispered. The dog let out a small, strained sigh and closed its eyes, still touching Liam's hand. Daniel turned away, blinking rapidly. Sarah crouched beside them, her voice shaking. Sweetheart, how do you know that? Liam didn't look at her. He was too focused, too connected. Because I heard him, he said softly. He told me before, and now he says it again. He says, I came just in time. Dr. Keller, standing quietly in the background, blinked. Sarah turned toward her. Is that even possible? That he could recognize Liam already? The vet hesitated, then smiled gently. It's rare, but not impossible. Trauma creates bonds. So does rescue. But they've never met. The vet looked at the dog again, now fully relaxed against Liam's legs, the wires gently swaying with each tiny movement. Maybe not in the way we understand. An hour later, the vet gave the okay for brief contact. Sarah and Daniel sat on either side of Liam as the boy continued to stroke the dog's head, whispering things none of them could quite make out. Sarah asked, does he have a name? Liam paused, then nodded. Echo. Daniel tilted his head. Why Echo? Liam looked up, eyes clear. Because he's the part that answered when no one else did. No one spoke for a moment. Then Daniel nodded. Echo it is. Bye. By morning, the clinic offered to keep Echo for a few days to stabilize him, but they encouraged visitation. The staff were stunned by the progress, already visible vitals, strengthening appetite flickering back, even the first attempt at sitting upright, but only when Liam was in the room. The moment the boy left for the restroom or was distracted, Echo would grow still again, almost as if conserving energy for reunion. Dr. Keller pulled Sarah aside. I don't know what you believe in, she said quietly. But that dog was holding on for something. Or someone. Now we know who. Sarah nodded slowly, eyes damp. I think he knew Liam before we did. That afternoon, they brought a small toy. Liam insisted on giving Echo a blue stuffed elephant with one eye missing. He said it'll help him sleep, Liam explained solemnly. Echo sniffed it once, then tucked his nose under it like a pillow. And for the first time since his rescue, he slept without twitching. Liam sat by his side the whole time, one hand resting gently on his back, like he'd done it 100 times before. The snow had begun to melt, but not completely. Thin sheets of ice still clung to the roof and eaves, and the gutters ran with slow, slushy drips. It was late afternoon when Sarah sat in the kitchen alone, her laptop glowing faintly in the fading light. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago untouched. Liam and Echo were still at the clinic, though Liam insisted he wanted to stay with him just a little longer, and Daniel had agreed to watch over them. That left Sarah with silence and questions. Too many. She stared at the search bar for several long minutes, fingers hovering above the keys, like they might summon something darker than code or information. Then finally she typed Caraway Lane. House 112, previous owner, Toronto. The first few results were typical zoning listings, a few old sales records. Nothing surprising. But tucked between them, under a digitized scan of a 2008 community bulletin, was a headline that caught her breath. Walter G. Harrow missing. Elderly man last seen outside 112 Caraway Lane. She clicked. The article was brief. One of those filler pieces that small-town papers ran before dinner. But the details were unmistakable. Walter, age 72, described as reclusive but kind, was last seen walking his dog on a cold October evening 12 years ago. The neighbor who'd spotted him last said Walter had nodded and waved, same as always. He wore a thick flannel coat, a brown cap, and trailed behind a brown mutt with a tail like a question mark. Neither man nor dog had been seen since. No witnesses, no leads, no sign of struggle. Just gone. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her stomach tightening. She opened another tab. Walter G. Harrow obituary. Nothing, which meant no body, no death certificate. Just disappearance. The room around her felt suddenly smaller. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number on the bulletin contact for the original listing agent, now retired, but his info still linked. The man who picked up sounded like he'd been woken from a nap. Harrow, he repeated groggily. Yeah, that was the guy. Owned it before. What's this about? I live there now, with my family. I just had some questions. A pause, then a sigh. Look, I don't know much. He kept to himself. Kind of a local ghost. Used to see him with that dog all the time. Scruffy thing. Sweet, though. Then one day gone. They looked around for a while, but nothing turned up. She swallowed. And the house? No signs of anything. He chuckled bitterly. Lady, it was locked up tighter than a drum. No blood, no prints, no foul play. Hell, for all anyone knew, he walked out into the woods and froze. But the dog, that's the weird part, he admitted. A neighbor swore they saw it sniffing around the porch 2 days after Walter disappeared. Then it vanished too. Sarah's fingers clenched around the phone. Do you remember the neighbor's name? He paused again. Try the Ridleys. Live 3 doors down. Think the old man passed, but his wife might still be there. Can't promise much. Was a long time ago. She thanked him, hung up, and sat motionless for several long minutes. Then she grabbed her coat and stepped into the snow. Mrs. Ridley was in her late 80s, but sharper than Sarah expected. She answered the door with a cane in one hand and a cigarette in the other, raising one paper-thin eyebrow when Sarah introduced herself. Ah, you're in Walter's place. Sarah nodded. Yes, my family moved in 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Ridley peered past her, as if trying to see the house from where she stood. Still creaks, doesn't it? Constantly. It always did talk too much. They sat inside for tea, black bitter, no sugar, and Sarah explained as much as she dared. That her son had heard things, seen things, that a dog had been found. Not all the details. Not yet. Mrs. Ridley listened mostly in silence. Then finally she sighed. He was a lonely man, Walter. Lived there nearly 20 years. Always had that mutt by his side. Never named it far as I know, just called it boy, like it was kin. Did you know him well? I brought him pies in the winter. He gave me tomatoes from his garden in spring. That was about it. Didn't talk much. But I saw him smile around that dog, more than I saw most men smile at their wives. Sarah blinked. And then he vanished. Into the fog, Mrs. Ridley said, lips tightening, like something from a story. One day, he was waving to me with his coffee mug in hand, and the next, nothing. Sarah hesitated. Did they ever suspect foul play? Only people who live in TV shows think something bad has to leave behind a mess. I don't think Walter left. I think someone took him. Sarah's chest tightened. But who would hurt an old man? Mrs. Ridley stared into her tea. Maybe someone who didn't want the dog. That night, Sarah didn't speak a word on the drive back to the clinic. Her hands were cold on the steering wheel. Her mind was hot with memory flashes of the crate of the dog's sunken ribs, of the way it had responded only to Liam. A timeline she hadn't dared trace before now started to form. 12 years. 12 years ago, Walter Harrow vanished with a dog that fit Echo's exact description. Echo, who somehow was still alive, who had been trapped, and Liam was hearing things he shouldn't know, not imagining, describing. Back at the clinic, she found Daniel asleep in the visitor's chair, chin on chest, one arm curled protectively around Liam's small form. Liam was half awake, eyes fluttering, and beside him, loyal, watchful, was Echo, awake. His head rested against Liam's hip, breathing shallow but even. One paw twitched every now and then, as though remembering something it had once run toward. Sarah knelt quietly. Liam stirred, his eyes opened slowly, and when he saw her, he smiled faintly. "I told you," he said, voice scratchy. "Told me what, baby?" "That he remembered me." Sarah's heart faltered. "Remembered you?" Liam nodded. "From before." Sarah swallowed hard. "Before what?" Liam didn't answer right away. He reached down, brushed a gentle hand along Echo's ear. "There was yelling," he said softly. Then a bang. Then it got very quiet. Then very dark. Echo said it hurt. Not his body, his heart. Sarah couldn't breathe. Then someone put him in the box. And he waited. And waited. And he started to forget what outside felt like. Until I came. Tears blurred Sarah's vision. She reached out, took his hand. "You're the reason he's alive," she whispered. No, Liam replied. "He's the reason I'm here." He leaned down, kissed the dog's head, and whispered something so soft that even Sarah couldn't hear. But Echo's eyes closed, peacefully, and he sighed long and deep, like he'd been waiting for that exact moment for years. It began with a story, not one that Sarah read aloud, not something from a picture book or cartoon rerun, but one that came quietly, unprompted from Liam's mouth as he sat in the sunroom, legs folded beneath him, Echo curled beside him like an old guardian statue. "There was a garden," he said softly. Sarah was standing in the doorway, halfway through, pouring herself a cup of tea, and stopped. "What garden, sweetheart?" Liam didn't answer at first. His gaze stayed locked on something invisible in the middle distance, far beyond the frost-dusted windows. "Back behind the house," he finally said. "He used to throw the ball. Not far, just to the rose bushes." "Who did?" the man Liam said. His hands shook, but the dog always waited for him to steady. Sarah stepped closer. "What else do you remember?" Liam turned to her, head tilted, like he wasn't sure how much she could handle. He would hum songs that didn't have words. And sometimes, Liam said, voice dropping a little, he talked out loud to no one. Just to the sky. Like he was waiting for someone to answer. Sarah sat down. Liam looked at Echo, who blinked slowly, still resting. He liked it when the wind came through the trees, Liam said. He said it reminded him of someone. Sarah felt the fine hairs on her neck rise. "Who told you all that?" Liam placed a hand on Echo's head. "He did." She tried to breathe through the tightness in her chest. "When?" Liam blinked. "Last night, when we both couldn't sleep." That evening, when Liam was in the kitchen, Sarah retrieved her phone. She opened the voice memo app, hit record, and placed it quietly on the armrest of the living room chair. Then she said casually, "Tell me about the man again." Liam didn't question her. He spoke as if narrating someone else's memory. Not like a child telling a tale, but like someone remembering a dream they hadn't lived through, but had felt. "He used to sit on the porch after dinner," Liam said. "The dog would lie next to him, and they watched the birds fly back to the woods." He paused. Sarah waited. Then one day someone came. Not a neighbor, not a friend, just someone angry. Her hand clenched on the armrest. Liam's tone shifted, went quieter. The man said something like, "You always cared more about it than about us." And he pushed him. "Who did?" "I don't know," Liam said, shrugging. He wore a jacket that smelled like gas, and he had a scar on his cheek. The man tried to stand, but he hit him with something heavy. Sarah's breath caught. Liam looked down. Then there was red on the porch. He didn't cry. He didn't blink. He just kept going. The dog barked. He wouldn't stop. So the angry man grabbed him, dragged him down the stairs, put him in the box, and hammered it shut. Said something like, "Let's see how long you last without him." A long silence followed. Echo shifted beside Liam, letting out a low whimper. Sarah reached for the phone with shaking fingers and stopped the recording. Then she stood, walked into the kitchen, and sat in the dark. For several minutes, she didn't move. Later that night, when Liam had gone to bed and the house had fallen into a hush, Sarah sat on the floor, laptop, open phone beside her. She searched online for any archived police reports about Walter Harrow's disappearance, digging deeper than she had before. Most reports were vague, some redacted, but then she found a scanned interview summary dated October 15th, 12 years ago. A neighbor, Thomas Riggs, described a young man visiting Walter's property a few days before the disappearance. No name, but the man was described as in his 30s, white, wearing a brown canvas jacket, thin build scar on left cheek. Sarah felt ice tighten around her heart. She rewound Liam's recording and listened again. A jacket that smelled like gas, a scar on his cheek. She compared the phrases. Word for word. Perfect match. Liam had no way of knowing that. She stared at her phone for a long time, then pressed a hand to her mouth. Oh my God. Bye. That same night, something else happened. Sarah had just begun to drift off when she heard the first bark. It wasn't loud. Not the kind of bark meant to warn or attack. It was short, controlled. She sat up, heart pounding. Another bark came muffled from downstairs. She crept down the staircase, past the fourth step, past the living room where the moonlight painted long shadows across the floor. She found Echo standing in the hallway outside the basement door. Still, alert, eyes fixed on the darkness. His tail was low, rigid. Then he barked again, twice low and sharp, as if commanding something unseen to keep its distance. Echo, she whispered. He didn't look at her. He was guarding, protecting, watching something she couldn't see. She moved toward him slowly, laid a hand gently on his back. The dog didn't flinch, but he leaned slightly against her, never taking his eyes off the basement door. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. Neither did he. Liam had a dream, or maybe it wasn't. In the dream, he was standing in the garden behind the house. The roses were in bloom, though they hadn't bloomed since they moved in. Echo was beside him, but not weak anymore. His fur gleamed his eyes, alert and joyful. In front of them sat a man on a wooden bench, hands folded neatly in his lap. He wore a flannel coat. His face was wrinkled but kind, and his eyes, they looked like Echo's. Exactly like Echo's. Liam walked closer, unsure. The man smiled. Thank you, he said. For what? Liam asked. For hearing him. For listening when no one else did. Liam sat beside him. Echo lay at their feet. I didn't know what to do, Liam whispered. I just felt him. That's more than most ever do, the man said. He waited for you. You came. Liam looked up. Was he always mine? The man nodded slowly, in every way that matters. Then he stood brushing off invisible dust. Take care of him. He carries pieces of me. I will, Liam promised. The man's figure began to fade in the golden light that warmed the sky. As the dream dissolved, Liam heard a final whisper. You've made him whole again. Sarah was in the kitchen the next morning when Liam padded in, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Morning, sweetheart, she said, trying to sound normal. Liam climbed onto a stool, blinking slowly. I saw him, he said. Sarah froze. Who? The man from before. Echo's person. She set down her cup slowly. What did he say? Liam smiled, sleepy and sure. He said thank you. He said Echo's home now. Sarah crossed the room and wrapped him in her arms, holding him longer than necessary. Did he tell you anything else? She whispered. Liam shook his head. He didn't have to. I already knew. Sarah pulled back, brushing hair from his forehead. Then faintly from the living room, Echo barked once. Just once. A sound of calm. A sound of knowing. Sarah turned toward it, heart pounding, but felt something different this time. Not fear, not tension, but peace. And somewhere, somehow, an old voice echoed in the corners of the house. Thank you for listening. It was a Tuesday. Cold, but clear. The kind of bright, brittle morning where even the sun looked cautious behind thin clouds. Sarah stood on the porch with a mug of tea in her hands, watching Liam and Echo in the yard. The boy was bundled in layers, cheeks pink, with the crisp air, his small hands clutching a foam ball. Echo padded beside him, leaner now, but recovering his movements slower than most dogs his age, but steady, and his eyes never far from Liam. Something about the two of them, how effortlessly they synced, still pulled at Sarah's heart. Like a balance had been restored to something that had gone wrong long before they'd arrived. Then she saw the man. He was at the end of the street, just standing there, not walking, not shoveling snow, not tying a dog, just watching. Sarah blinked, tilted her head. He didn't move. Tall, lean, hands in the pockets of a thick brown canvas jacket. Even from a distance, there was something off about his posture. The way his chin tilted down just slightly. The stillness of it. Echo's head snapped toward the street. His body stiffened. The ball dropped from Liam's hand and hit the snow with a soft thud. Echo growled, low, deep. A sound Sarah hadn't heard from him since the day they pulled him from under the stairs. Liam, she called, come back up here. The boy didn't answer. He was frozen, staring at the man. And the man, he was staring back. Then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was recognition, ownership, control. Sarah's heart slammed into her ribs. Liam now. Echo stepped in front of the boy, head low, teeth bared. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. Sarah rushed down the steps just as Daniel emerged from the house behind her, carrying Liam's scarf. What's going on? She pointed. That man. Daniel turned just as the stranger began walking toward them, slow and deliberate. Sarah's breath hitched. Echo didn't move from Liam's side, but his growling deepened so low it made the ground seem to vibrate. The man stopped at the foot of their driveway. "Can I help you?" Daniel called out. The man tilted his head, his eyes flicking toward Echo, then Liam, then back to Daniel. "This house," he said, voice gruff but casual, "used to belong to someone I knew." Sarah stepped up beside Daniel. "Walter Harrow?" she asked. The man didn't blink. "My uncle?" There it was. Sarah's blood chilled. "Funny," Daniel said. Stepping forward, "No one mentioned any family when we bought the place." "Yeah," the man said. "Family's complicated." Echo surged forward with a sudden snarl, planting himself between Liam and the stranger. "Call your dog off," the man said, stepping back slightly. "He's not mine," Daniel said, "and he doesn't like you." The man's eyes narrowed. "So you're the ones who found the mud." Daniel took another step forward. "You know him." "I knew the dog," he said. "He used to be mine. Back when he had a real name." Sarah's heart skipped. Liam's voice came from behind Echo. "No, he was never yours." The man's expression shifted. There was a flash of something: surprise, disgust, rage, but it disappeared too quickly. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," he said. "I just wanted to see the place again. You know, pay my respects." Echo barked once, sharp, explosive. "Yeah," Daniel said. "We're not buying it." Then everything happened fast. The man lunged, not toward Liam, not toward Sarah, toward Daniel. It wasn't a wild attack. It was controlled, practiced. His hand shot out, grabbed Daniel by the collar, and shoved hard. Daniel staggered back, slipped on the icy path, and went down hard. Sarah screamed. Echo exploded forward, a blur of fur and fury. The man raised an arm to block, but it was too late. Echo slammed into him with a force Sarah didn't think the dog still had teeth snapping near his wrist, body pressing him back into the driveway. Daniel scrambled to his feet, face flushed and bleeding from a scrape along his jaw. The man shoved Echo off violently, but the dog recovered instantly. Teeth-bared stance, defensive. "Call him off," the man roared. "You don't get to give orders," Daniel growled, stepping between them again. Sarah already had her phone out, dialing. Her voice shook as she gave the dispatcher their address. The man took a step back, realizing the tide had turned. But Echo kept circling him, low and deliberate, like a wolf remembering its predator. "Police are on the way," Sarah said. The man spat blood onto the snow, straightened his coat, and turned to leave. "I didn't do anything." "No," Sarah said. "Not today." The cops arrived 7 minutes later. 2 cruisers' lights flashing in the crisp daylight. Daniel gave his statement. So did Sarah. Then Liam, in his own quiet way, spoke up. "He tried to hurt my dad. He's the one who locked Echo up." "I know, because Echo remembers." The officers, to their credit, didn't laugh. Instead, one of them, a younger detective named Farrow, walked slowly back to the car, returned with a manila folder. "Walter Harrow's case," he said. "We reopened it last year when someone found a handwritten will in a storage unit. This guy," he tapped the paper, "was listed as next of kin, but no one could find him." "Until now," Sarah murmured. Farrow nodded. "And he was a suspect once. But there wasn't any evidence." He turned to Echo, who was still pressed against Liam's side, watching every movement with wary eyes. "Guess we have some now." "What happens next?" Daniel asked. The detective didn't smile. "We bring him in. We question him again. And maybe this time we find the box he didn't want found." As they led the man away in cuffs, Liam stood silently on the porch, Echo beside him. The man looked back one last time, eyes fixed not on the adults, but on the child, then on the dog, and something flickered across his face. Rage, maybe? Or fear. Then he was gone. That night the house was quiet. No creaks, no whispers, no dark knocking behind the walls. Just Echo curled at the foot of Liam's bed, his breathing deep, peaceful, and Liam smiling in his sleep. It was Echo who led them there. 3 days after the arrest, the snow had mostly melted, revealing the hardened earth underneath, splotchy and cold. The backyard stretched behind the house like a forgotten canvas, neglected flower beds, cracked flagstones, remnants of a life once lived in solitude. Liam had been strangely quiet that morning, not withdrawn, just listening. Sarah had noticed it the moment he stepped out onto the porch. He wasn't looking around aimlessly the way kids did when let outside. He was tracking something, not with his eyes, with something else. And Echo had matched him step for step. No barking, no tail wagging, just silent resolve. Daniel followed, shovel in hand, though he didn't quite know why. There'd been a tone in Liam's voice when he'd asked. No told them that they needed to see the garden. Echo paused beside an old tree at the edge of the yard, gnarled and bare-limbed its roots. Split around an old stone birdbath. The ground near the base had eroded slightly, revealing packed earth with strange patterns worn into it, as if something had once been dragged across it again and again. Echo placed one paw on the spot, then another. Then he started digging. At first it was slow, hesitant. His legs still hadn't fully recovered. But as his claws broke the surface, his movements quickened. With every stroke, more dirt kicked up until Liam bent down beside him and began using his small hands to help. Daniel stepped forward, set the shovel to the side, and knelt. It didn't take long. Just a few inches below the surface, the tip of something metallic appeared, dull gray, flecked with rust. A box. Squared at the edges, latched, but not locked. Sarah dropped to her knees beside them. Daniel brushed the rest of the dirt away, pried it loose, and lifted it out. It was heavier than he expected. He clicked open the latch. Inside was a photograph. Just one. A single faded print of a man seated on a porch step. His arms wrapped around a dog that looked, despite the years, despite the weight of time, undeniably like Echo. Walter Harrow and his companion. The image looked frozen in a moment of quiet joy. The dog's tongue hung out in an awkward mid-bark lull, one of Walter's eyes half closed in laughter. It wasn't a portrait, it was a memory. Caught, not posed. The kind people buried because they were too perfect to leave to chance. Liam stared at it for a long moment, his fingers hovering just above the edges of the photo. He told me it was here, he whispered. Sarah looked at him. Walter? Liam nodded. He said it was the last thing that was his. The only thing no one could take. Echo whined softly beside him, ears twitching, but he wasn't done yet. The dog moved again, just a few feet away, toward the concrete slab at the back corner of the yard. It had always seemed out of place, newer than the surrounding stones poured unevenly, like a rushed repair. Echo scratched at the edge, once, twice, then looked back at them. Liam's voice was soft. He said he's there. Daniel stood slowly, shovel still in hand, and stared at the slab. No, he muttered. No, that can't be. Sarah's voice came from behind him. Call Detective Farrow. The police arrived within the hour. The same detective who'd cuffed the man in the brown jacket now stood in the backyard of 112 Caraway Lane Sleeves, rolled up eyes heavy with reluctant curiosity. You're sure about this? He asked Sarah quietly. She didn't answer with words. She simply nodded to her son, now sitting beside Echo in the grass, holding the photograph in his lap, waiting. Farrow gave the go-ahead. The officers worked quickly, jackhammering around the edge first, then breaking the concrete in jagged, careful chunks. Beneath it packed earth, then cloth, then bone. There was no mistaking it. What had once been Walter Harrow lay curled beneath the slab clothes, still intact, skeletal hand, still wrapped around what looked like a cane's handle. No casket, no marker, just hidden history. And beside the remains, a blood-stained hammer. Rusty, worn, familiar. Farrow knelt beside the excavation site. One of the officers handed him a file photo. Same coat, same build, same man. He stood slowly, brushing his hands clean. Well, he said, I guess the dog was the witness after all. Sarah couldn't breathe. Neither could Daniel. Farrow walked over to Liam, crouched in front of him, and for a long time didn't speak. Then you helped us find him. Liam didn't look up from the photo. He was tired of waiting. Farrow hesitated. How did you? Sarah shook her head. You won't believe it. The detective gave a short, bitter laugh. Lady, I just watched a dog dig up a 12-year-old murder. I'll believe anything. He turned to go. But before he left, he paused. Tell your son he did good, he said. Not many people listen to the past when it whispers. The rest of the day unfolded in a blur. Forensics, cameras, tents, blue gloves, and quiet murmurs. The official report would later state the remains had been positively identified via dental records. That cause of death matched blunt force trauma consistent with the weapon found nearby. That the man now in custody, Walter's estranged nephew, had been in the city at the time. Had motive, had opportunity. Now at last, he had evidence stacked against him. But long before any of that was filed or signed, something else had already changed. That night, the wind shifted through the trees in a new way. The walls of the house no longer creaked with hesitation. The stairs, for once, were silent, and Echo slept without flinching. Later, after the tents were gone and the officers had left, the backyard looked different, emptier, but lighter. Liam knelt in the spot where Walter had been found, Echo at his side. The ground was still raw. The grass had not yet regrown, but the earth no longer felt heavy. Liam reached out, laid his hand on the soil. Then he leaned toward Echo and whispered something only the dog could hear. He said he's not waiting anymore. Echo let out a soft exhale, like a sigh of agreement, then rested his head on Liam's lap and closed his eyes. The day Echo officially became part of the McNeil family was not marked with balloons or announcements, but with something far more permanent, a signature, a quiet handshake, and the kind of silence that only comes when something long broken finally clicks into place. The vet had said the paperwork was just a formality, that technically by law no one could claim the dog anyway, no microchip, no history in any national registry, no owner. His past was shadows, but not anymore. Echo Harrow McNeil. Sarah had joked quietly, filling in the name line on the adoption form. Liam had beamed. Daniel had chuckled under his breath. The clerk at the desk had looked up curious. You want me to add the Harrow part? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he said. That part matters. Echo settled into the house, not with the clumsy energy of a puppy, but with the grace of something old returning to familiar ground. He no longer barked at shadows, no longer circled door frames or flinched at sudden movement. He had space now. And he had Liam. They were inseparable, not just in the physical sense, but in the way their rhythms synchronized, waking, walking, sleeping. If Liam laughed, Echo perked up. If Liam got quiet, Echo leaned his head against the boy's side as if to remind him that whatever silence had taken him, he wasn't facing it alone. The nightmares stopped. Liam began sleeping through the night, his breathing, even his brow smooth. And for the first time since they'd moved into the house, so did Sarah and Daniel. It was during one of these new, quiet mornings, when the sun hadn't yet crested the trees. But the air carried the promise of thaw that Liam sat at the kitchen table, crayons scattered in a lazy circle around him. He was drawing again. Sarah passed behind him, heading toward the coffee pot, and paused mid-step. The page in front of Liam was alive with color. He'd drawn 3 figures, himself in his favorite yellow jacket, Echo mid-run, tongue hanging out, tail like a flag behind him. And beside them, taller, older, stood a man with a warm smile and soft eyes. His hand rested on Echo's back. His other hand held a cup of coffee. The mug had steam rising from it, curling into a heart-shaped puff above his head. Sarah felt her throat catch. She knew that face. She'd only ever seen it in one photograph, faded, found buried in a metal box under the roots of a dying tree. Walter Harrow. Liam didn't look up. He kept coloring the sky in long, even strokes. "He says it's warmer now," he murmured. Sarah blinked back tears. "He says the cold doesn't hurt anymore." Daniel found her later that evening, standing in the hallway, staring at the drawing taped proudly to the fridge. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded. She shook her head, smiling through the ache. "I don't know how he knows what peace looks like." Daniel slipped an arm around her waist, maybe because he's finally living it. That night, Sarah stood at the doorway of Liam's room. He was fast asleep, one hand curled into Echo's fur, the dog breathing in slow, even rhythms. The two of them fit together like puzzle pieces, a living silhouette of trust. She didn't call out, didn't say anything, just watched. Behind her, Daniel appeared silently and wrapped his arms around her from behind. His chin rested on her shoulder. They both breathed in sync, watching their son sleep like he hadn't in months. "Remember the first night here?" he whispered. She nodded. He was scared of the stairs. Daniel's voice cracked faintly. "Now he owns them." A quiet laugh slipped out of her chest. In that moment, there were no ghosts, no boxes, no whispers, just the warmth of a family knit together through fire grief and something too sacred for words. The next day, the sun came out fully for the first time since they'd moved in, and stayed. The light poured through the front windows, illuminating dust motes and softening corners. It brought color back to the floorboards, made the house feel like it was exhaling after years of holding its breath. Liam was the first to suggest a walk. "Just around the block," he said, gripping Echo's leash with both hands. "Echo wants to see the trees." Sarah smiled. "I think we could all use some trees." They dressed lightly, the first signs of spring creeping into the air, and stepped outside. The world was different now. Cleaner, calmer, open. They didn't speak much as they walked. Liam led the way, his cheeks pink with wind, his laughter trailing behind him like wind chimes. Echo trotted beside him, alert but relaxed, sniffing the corners of every mailbox like it was the first time he'd been allowed to. Daniel held Sarah's hand. Behind them, the sun filtered through the trees, spilling golden light across the pavement. The birds had returned. The breeze was soft. Each step was easy. No dialogue, just the hum of life beginning again, and the sound of healing unfolding in real time. Back at the house, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, Sarah lit a small candle and placed it on the windowsill. Not for superstition, not for ceremony, just remembrance. Liam padded into the room, Echo trailing behind him, and sat quietly at her side. "Is that for Walter?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." "He knows," Liam said. Then he turned and walked to the couch, climbed up, and let Echo rest his head in his lap. Sarah stood still for a long time, watching the candle flicker. Then she smiled, because for the first time since they'd arrived at 112 Caraway Lane, there was no more waiting. There was only belonging. The attic hadn't been opened in years. The narrow staircase groaned beneath Sarah's weight as she ascended, dust spiraling around her like dandelion seeds. The light from her phone cut through the darkness, illuminating wooden beams, forgotten boxes, and the fragile scent of paper aging in silence. She hadn't meant to come up here, but that morning, something had pulled her, an instinct, a breath, a flicker, in her periphery while she folded towels. Echo had paused at the foot of the stairs, ears perked, then turned away with a quiet huff. Like a door had opened somewhere unseen, and he was simply acknowledging it. The trunk sat in the far corner. Its lid was warped, but not locked. Inside were the memories of another man's life, yellowed newspaper clippings, faded photographs, books annotated in tight, careful script, and a notebook, bound in leather edges, worn pages brittle. She sat cross-legged on the floor and opened it. "Time 08. The pain in my knees is worse today." Boy helped me to the porch. He knows the rhythm now, 2 slow steps, pause, then 1 big breath. He waits for me to smile before he settles beside me. Loyal bastard. Sarah flipped ahead, her fingers trembling. T-1013. Cold front moved in. The heater clanked like it's dying. Boy sat by the radiator anyway. Sometimes I think he listens better than people do. Sometimes I think he understands things I haven't said out loud. Another page. If 1018, my nephew came by again. Wanted money. Said I owed him for what I didn't give his father. Told him I didn't owe him anything. He said I'd regret that. Boy barked. First time he ever barked at someone like that. Sarah's heart pounded. Thigh 10 to 20. If anything happens, if I don't get a chance to finish this life the way I planned, I want someone to find him. Save him. He's the only part of me that matters now. If someone saves him, I can rest. He is what's left of me. He is my echo. Her breath hitched. She closed the book, gently tears threading down her cheeks. The room seemed quieter now, like something in the air had shifted. She didn't realize Liam was standing behind her until he spoke. He told you too. She turned. Liam stood barefoot, pajama-clad Echo by his side, eyes bright in the dimness. Told me what? That Echo is the part he left behind, Liam said. So someone would know how he loved. Sarah swallowed hard. Did he say that to you? Liam nodded. In the dream. The one by the garden. He said when Echo's safe, he'll finally be okay. He looked down at the dog, who wagged his tail once, then turned his head toward the stairs. Sarah followed his gaze and froze. At the base of the attic stairwell, just beyond the frame of the doorway, the hallway seemed to shimmer. Just briefly. Not light, not shadow. A flicker of a figure. Familiar? Still. Watching. Echo barked once, not loud but resolute. The sound echoed through the house, like a bell struck in a cathedral. Then it was gone. The shimmer. The figure. The air returned to stillness. Sarah slowly rose to her feet. Did you see? Liam didn't answer. He just stepped forward to where the figure had been, then stopped. Thank you, he whispered. And as Echo came to stand beside him, the hallway somehow felt warmer. Brighter. Lighter. They came downstairs together. Sarah carried the notebook like a sacred relic, cradled close. She set it on the mantel later that night, next to the photograph they'd framed, the one of Walter and Echo now restored and whole. Daniel lit a small candle beside it. No words were spoken. None were needed. Time. As the sky deepened into twilight, Liam sat curled on the window seat, watching the light shift across the trees. Echo rested with his chin on the boy's legs, tail twitching with contentment. Sarah stood nearby, arms crossed over her chest. She couldn't stop looking at them, at the bond, at the simplicity of healing when it's given time and space to breathe. Liam looked up at her. He's not watching anymore, he said. Sarah blinked. Who? Walter? He said goodbye. Sarah nodded. And what did you say? Liam smiled soft and sad. I said I'll take care of Echo. And he said, I know. That night as they tucked Liam into bed, the house felt different. Not in its shape or its sounds, but in its silence. It no longer held its breath. It no longer braced for memory. It simply was. Liam lay under the blanket, eyes half closed, his hand resting in Echo's fur. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Echo's breathing was slow even. Liam whispered one final thing before his eyes closed. Good night, Mr. Walter. And from the hallway, for the briefest moment, Sarah could swear she heard a reply. A creak on the stair, a rustle of flannel, a farewell. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They don't thunder or weep. They arrive gently unfolding like a breath you didn't know you were holding. The morning was one of them. It began with laughter. Not loud, not wild. Just honest, unfiltered. The kind that bubbled up over coffee toast and the creak of chairs pushed back from the kitchen table. It came from Liam first, watching Echo try and fail to steal a slice of bacon off Daniel's plate. Daniel feigned protest. Sarah rolled her eyes. The dog gave a low, unapologetic grunt and thudded down beside Liam's bare feet like a knight returning from battle. Later that morning, Sarah stood by the old Polaroid camera resting on the hallway shelf. It had been Walter's once. She found it tucked behind a stack of letters in the attic, the film still usable, the lens smudged by time. She cleaned it, wiped the glass, slid in a new pack of film, like reviving a memory with her own hands. Let's take a picture, she said. Daniel looked up from the couch. Of what? Of us. Liam grinned from the floor, Echo's head in his lap. Do I have to wear shoes? No shoes, Sarah smiled. Just smiles. They set up the tripod in the living room, angled toward the window. The light poured in golden and full warm against the walls. Daniel stood on one side, Sarah on the other. Liam knelt in the middle. And Echo, dignified, regal, a little crooked in the hip, sat between them, ears perked, eyes gleaming. The timer clicked, the shutter flashed, and the moment became memory. That afternoon, Liam asked for his crayons again, but not the usual ones. Not the broken stubs or the faded markers. The new box, the one Sarah had tucked away for when you're ready. He spread the paper on the floor, tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration, and drew in long, patient lines. He didn't speak, didn't hum, just breathed. Drew. Created. Sarah didn't ask. She only watched from the doorway, arms folded softly across her chest, heart thudding in quiet anticipation. An hour passed, then 2, and finally he looked up. "It's done," he whispered. He held it out like something sacred. She took it with care. It was beautiful. A bridge wide and arched, made of light itself. Not wood, not stone, but light. Soft beams of gold, white, and pale blue curved across a valley of starlight, connecting 2 sides of something unseen. On one side, Liam had drawn a house, their house, with the porch and the tree and the staircase. On the other, Walter stood smiling, one hand raised in farewell. Beside him, Echo walked calmly, tail held high, body full and strong. Not a ghost, not a memory, just whole. "They're going somewhere safe," Liam said. But he said part of Echo stays here, the part that loves us. Sarah knelt slowly, drawing him into her arms. Her voice trembled. "It's beautiful." He leaned into her. "It's true." That evening, just before dinner, she brought the drawing to the staircase. The 4th step had been repaired weeks ago, but they'd left one part untouched, a knot in the wood slightly discolored, like a fingerprint pressed into time. Sarah held the drawing in her hands, fingers trembling just slightly. Then carefully she hung it on the wall beside the staircase. Not in a frame, just 2 small pins, like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. The paper curled gently at the edges. The bridge glowed in the light from the hallway lamp, and from the front window the last rays of sunlight poured into the house, catching the drawing in its path, casting its glow perfectly over the 4th step. Sarah didn't speak. She simply watched the light, then closed her eyes and breathed. Later that night, after Liam had gone to bed, and Echo had curled beside him like a faithful echo of warmth, Sarah and Daniel sat together in the living room. No TV, no phones, just stillness. Sarah reached over, laced her fingers with his. "I think we were meant to find this place," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "I think this place was waiting for us." They sat in silence, a silence that no longer felt empty. Then from upstairs, a quiet sound, a sigh, a small kick of a foot, the hush of a dog settling in deeper. Daniel stood first, stretched, offered her a hand. They walked upstairs together, past the photograph on the mantel, past the drawing on the wall, past the 4th step. Sarah paused, and in that pause, she didn't hear creaking or scratching. She heard peace. She heard home. The first snow came again, not like the one before, sharp and foreboding, but soft, heavy, and slow. It blanketed the roof in silence, settled on tree branches, like a secret too gentle to speak aloud. Inside the house on Caraway Lane, everything was still. Liam stood at the back door, forehead pressed to the glass, breath fogging the pain in slow pulses. Behind him, Echo sat patiently, eyes trained not on the snow, but on the boy, as if waiting for permission. Then Liam opened the door. Cold air spilled into the room like a baptism. But Liam didn't flinch. He stepped barefoot onto the porch, bundled tight in his coat wool hat, slightly crooked. Echo padded out behind him, paws crunching against the thin crust of fresh powder. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, coffee cradled in her hands, watching them descend the porch steps and vanish into the white. Daniel joined her, one arm sliding around her waist. Together they watched their son and his dog disappear into the snow-covered field behind the house, the same field Walter once walked alone, humming to the wind. But not today. Today no one walked alone. As they reached the center of the field, Liam paused. The world around them was hushed. No birds, no cars, no wind. Only the rhythmic whisper of falling snow. He turned toward Echo, crouched low, and whispered something into the dog's ear. Echo's ears perked. Then he ran, a long arcing sprint that kicked up powder in little flurries behind him, tail high, tongue loose. His body still bore signs of healing, but in that moment he ran like nothing had ever broken him. Liam followed, arms stretched like wings boots, crunching in time with his laughter. Sarah stepped onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket camera, forgotten in her hand. She watched through watery eyes as the boy and the dog chased each other through the snow, spinning, darting, collapsing into a laughing, panting heap. And somewhere beneath that, Sarah began to speak, not aloud, not to the others, but to us. Her voice measured, calm, filled with something ancient and maternal, cut gently through the silence. There are calls that don't come with sound. There are souls that only want to be heard and remembered. The scene slowed. Liam sat in the snow arms, wrapped tightly around Echo's neck. The dog didn't move, didn't blink, just leaned into the boy as if fusing 2 heartbeats into one. Snow drifted around them in slow motion, each flake suspended in air like a memory held just a moment longer than it should be. Sarah's voice continued. We don't always recognize love when it's quiet. When it hides in corners, or in the scratch of wood, or in the echo of a heartbeat buried under years of dust. But when we do, when we finally see it and hear it, something shifts. Something lost comes back. Liam looked upward, his cheeks flushed. his eyes gleaming not from cold but from something deeper. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply whispered, "Goodbye, Walter." Echo turned his head toward the sky, let out a single bark, clean, strong, final, and the wind picked up. Not sharp, not bitter, but warm, carrying with it something old and grateful. The house at 112 Caraway Lane stood tall behind them, wrapped in snow and silence. Inside, the staircase creaked gently, under no weight at all. On the wall, the drawing of the light bridge fluttered slightly, though no door had been opened. And on the fourth step, a shaft of sunlight broke through the window, catching in the wood like a memory resurfacing. Just for a moment, then gone. As the camera pulled back, the scene faded. The boy and the dog were now two silhouettes in the snow, growing smaller with each step, framed by falling light and infinite sky. And Sarah's voice returned one last time, soft now, like wind through tall grass. Love doesn't die. It waits for someone brave enough to remember it. The image slowed. Liam stopped running, turned to Echo and knelt once more, arms wrapped tight, forehead pressed to fur. The screen faded gently to black. No sound, no music, just breath. Then a single line emerged in white. Love doesn't die. It waits for someone to bring it back to life. Then silence, then credits, and a world that for just a moment had remembered how to listen.